Welcome back to another study of God's Word as we continue our study through the Gospel of Matthew. We're so thankful for you joining us and for studying along with us. If it's your first time to join us, we encourage you to go back and start at lesson 1 from the book of Matthew. We've come all the way to chapter 24, and so there's a lot of classes preceding this one, and I hope that you'll follow through and notice all the things along the way that have brought us to this point where Jesus is in Jerusalem now, and he is confronting the problems of Jerusalem, the problems of the nation of Israel, and as we'll see today, bringing that to a head in the prediction of the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem that would come not too many years later from the time that he is standing there. We have joining us today Jeff Carr and Caleb Valander from Pepper Road, and we're glad that they're joining us to follow along through this chapter today. And then Luke Capps is with us, and we're glad that he's able to be back with us today, joining us from Mississippi. In our class on Wednesday night, we were going through Matthew chapter 23, and in that chapter, Jesus has some very strong rebukes for the Pharisees and the scribes, their hypocrisy. And particularly, he is delivering those rebukes not to them in first person, though I do believe it's within their hearing, but rather he's delivering those rebukes to the people who are sort of under the thumb of the scribes and Pharisees. And he's exposing what poor leadership they have offered to the people. He exposes that from the get-go by saying, do what they say, but not what they do. And then he talks about those various things that they do, have done, and really that they're following in a long line of history when it comes to that kind of behavior, those who have killed the prophets all along the way. Well, he sort of concludes that dissertation, that those woes against the Pharisees, with really a soft conclusion in some ways. Now, there's some hardness to it, and certainly as we get into chapter 24, it's very hard. But there's a sense of compassion from Jesus as he says that what he would like to have done, his desire would have been to gather them like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. So that's his desire, but he says he's not able to do that. And Luke, why is it that Jesus is not able to gather them like a hen gathers her chicks under her wing?
Well, right after he says that he would do that and that he wants to, he ends in verse 37 by saying, and you were unwilling. So essentially, I think that this is just what Jesus says here is representative of man's history, Israel's history up to this point. And even after that, every time what you see is God is willing, but we are so unwilling to be saved. And I think in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is giving his sermon talking about the history of Israel, he talks over and over and over again about all these examples of Israel rejecting God ultimately, and rejecting to be saved by him, rejecting to be ruled by him. And ultimately what that brings every time is destruction and punishment, just punishment that they deserved. But also as you go through that history, it wasn't that God didn't give them a chance or give them a choice. Every single time they've been given a choice, but every single time they were unwilling. And so I think that when you read what Jesus says here, it should be something that pricks our hearts, because this shows us that God wants us to choose him, and he will give us the choice and chance and opportunity to choose him. But that choice is up to us, and we have to make it. And if we choose to reject him, well, what is going to be left is the destruction that he's going to talk about us, about Israel, leaving Israel desolate. And then into chapter 24, even more so, when he gets into more detail about that destruction.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things to realize there is that wrestling with the concept of God wanting something but not getting it. in a sense, we recognize that God can force the will, but here's such a good example of us seeing that he will not. That even though this is what he wants, he leaves the choice up to the people. And so ultimately, when Jesus says, I would have done this, he's saying, that's what I want. That would have been my desire. Their choice has been the ultimate deciding factor there. That doesn't make them more powerful than God. It is God yielding to people the right to make their own choice. And that what that means is that is more important to God, that we choose, than that he gets what he wants. And so he has left it up to them. They have made the choice. The response then is that their house is being left to them desolate. And so as we look at that idea is really going to be fleshed out in chapter 24. Then he says some words. He says, I'm leaving. He's leaving the temple, and you won't see me again. And he gives a time marker there. You won't see me until this time. Now, Caleb, did I assign you this question? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So tell us about when and how and when they would see him again.
So at this point, the majority of the Jews have rejected him and his teachings. And it's interesting. It says they will not see him again until they say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." That's the same phrasing that was used during his triumphal entry. And now that we're looking at a 180-degree turn from his reception then. So I think aside from the crucifixion, which is coming up, Jerusalem or the Jews as a nation would only be able to see him again until after they repent of their rejection of him and his teachings and believe his word and are saved and see him again in heaven.
Yeah. So I think that that notion is it's intriguing from the standpoint of this is the final departure from the temple, and so I think it's possible that the notion of Jesus coming back and them seeing him again and saying, "Blessed are you," could be the notion that some of these will be receptive to him. That there would be those who would receive the gospel, like in Acts chapter 2, and that they would have that difference in mentality. But I also think it can point to that ultimate reunion, as you speak of, the seeing him in heaven and crying those things out. It's interesting, though, that dichotomy between that and your house is being left to you desolate. So there's a hopefulness here that I think is possible. That here are people who are rejecting Jesus, that have rejected him, but they still have a chance to receive him. And that's even yet, while he's talking about his desire to gather them, even yet he's still talking about that future potential where they could be receptive of him. Well, then, as is suggested, we go into chapter 24 and we have an expansion of that idea of the house being left to them desolate. And I believe that the New Testament really highlights the notion of the destruction of Jerusalem, maybe more often even than we give credit to it. Now that's caused some people to sort of have a pendulum swing, and they think that the destruction of Jerusalem is the culmination of everything, and that it means everything. Well, it does mean a great deal. But that doesn't mean that it is everything. It is, I think, the final nail in a coffin. I think it's the final evidence that the old has passed away and the new kingdom has been established in its place. That the new kingdom is the body that has risen from the dead body of Israel. So with that in mind, we're going to look at chapter 24. We're going to notice some things that it says distinctly about the destruction of Jerusalem. And as we go on through that chapter, we'll see if there's some indicators of a transition from the talk of the destruction of Jerusalem, maybe to a more ultimate end. Now, some people think that the destruction of Jerusalem that's being discussed at the beginning of this chapter is actually talking about the end of the world, or the rapture, or something of that nature. And I think there's some evidence, some clear evidence that that's not the case. But we start out chapter 24 with, it seems to me, an almost comical type of scene. You look at chapter 23, and Jesus has come into the temple, and he's come to preach in the name of rebuke, in the name of really condemnation of the behavior and attitudes of the Pharisees. And then as they're coming out of the temple, chapter 24, as Jesus came out of the temple and was going away, when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. Now, Jeff, what do you think that they're doing, or why would they be pointing out these temple buildings?
Well, if we look at two of the other accounts, Mark 13 and Luke 21, I'll read Mark 13, the first verse. He gives a little more detail of what the disciples brought to Jesus in their observations. It says, this is Mark 13, verse 1. As he was coming out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." Speaking of the temple to the Jews at this time, it was the center and focal point of the Jewish worship. It was the center of worship. It was the meeting place of the Sanhedrin, the highest ranking council. It's where all of God's people would come and offer their sacrifices. It was the focal point and the one physical representation of God in their presence. So you see the importance, but there's so much irony in this discussion, because as you were alluding to in chapter 23, Jesus has just rebuked the Pharisees and scribes, the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders, for their hypocrisy. And one of the examples he gives is in verse 27. He says, "For you are like whitewashed tombs, which are on the outside appear beautiful, but on the inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanliness." And the last two questions we just discussed at the very end of chapter 23, he's saying, "I want to gather you in, but you're rejecting me." And then we walk out, and his disciples, on the heels of that discussion, start bringing up the physical beauty of the temple and its features, which is so ironic. And another irony is they're bringing up the beauty of this building and these buildings and their structure that were made by men's hands in the very presence of deity, the Son of God. And to me, that's the most striking irony of that conversation.
Yeah, it's there are several occasions where the disciples say things and you just think, how could you miss this? But let's recognize that Herod's temple is among the ancient wonders of the world. It was impressive, and for the most part, these are Jews that are not used to being in the presence of such grandeur. They are people from Capernaum, they're people from Galilee who are fishermen, who are outsiders. They're not the religious elite. And so as they come into Jerusalem, they're admiring really the same way we would. But they're admiring, as Jeff has pointed out, has caused them to really just so far miss the point of what Jesus has just been saying. I really like the connection between Jesus talking about the beauty of the external that the Pharisees focus on, and then right on the heels are the disciples saying, "Look at this beauty, look at this grandeur." And of course, Jesus has a very contrary message to their awe at the beauty of the temple. Instead of sort of glorying in the sight of those buildings, as it seems like his disciples were doing, Jesus rather tells them the destructive end that those buildings are going to come to. How does he describe that for us, Luke?
So in verse 2, He says, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." So what that sounds like to me is a complete and full, utter destruction. And this is something that he's kind of alluded to from time to time in the past as we've gone through Matthew, but especially as you're thinking about, I mean, at this point, that would be pretty devastating news, at least for most Jews, because they have the knowledge. They know that they are God's chosen people and God's nation. They're Israelites. They are Jews, but now they're being told by Jesus that this time of Israel was coming to an end, which I think would be very hard to take in. I mean, it would be very hard to contemplate, because again, you think about their whole history, all this time that God has blessed them, all this time that they have averted certain and utter destruction, like he's talking about now, simply because of their relationship with God. But now they're coming to a point where their time is coming to an end, and they have to acknowledge that and deal with that, or they will be left desolate. And so they're left with news that there's utter destruction coming, even to this wondrous and beautiful place that they would look at and think, well, that how honorable and how beautiful for God and for them as a people.
Yeah, and it's pretty clear what's being spoken of. Not one stone should be left upon another. The context is they are pointing to the temple, and Jesus is saying that the thing you're looking at, what you're admiring, it's going to be gone. It's going to be destroyed. And so that sets the context for us for what we're talking about as far as destruction. So as we go through the rest of the chapter, unless there are indicators that we're transitioning to a different subject, the subject matter is the very things that they're looking at. So that helps root us. It helps ground us into the reality of what they're looking at and what Jesus is responding to. Now, they want to know, well, what are you talking about? When is all this going to happen? And I think there's a possible conflation of ideas. When is the temple going to be destroyed? When is the end of all things, or the end of the age? And so it's possible that maybe they're asking more than one question at a time. Maybe their thought process is, when the temple is destroyed, well, then what else is left? I mean, that's got to be the end of the world, right? And so maybe we'll see multiple layers to Jesus' answer, where he starts in on, okay, this is when this is going to happen. But then as to your other question, maybe there's a different answer. And so we'll look for that transition as we go through the rest of the chapter. But to begin with, as far as answering that question of when is all this going to happen, Jesus doesn't start by saying, well, who knows? Rather, he says, here are some things that are going to happen before that time. And Caleb, can you list off for us some of the things that Jesus says are going to happen before the destruction of Jerusalem?
He mentions there's several things they mention. There's false Christs leading many astray, wars and rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes, persecution, torture, and the killing of the faithful. And that's all in verses 4 through, oops, no, wrong section. There we go. Yeah, verses 6 through roughly 9 or 10. And he also mentions how the ones that fall away to the false prophets will start to betray the ones that are faithful, and they'll have strife because of that.
Yeah, and so what we find is that, first of all, a lot of things that are not abnormal over the course of history. but it seems that there will be an increase in intensity of those things. So this will happen. And I think, like today, there are, as you mentioned, those false prophets, those false Christs who will use that and say, see, do you see all these things? And then they'll sort of glom on to that. And there will be people who will respond to that, who will follow after that, who will be led astray by those things. Verse 12, because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, he says. And so the majority, in fact, of the people of Jerusalem, I think, will follow along after the lawlessness, after the sort of the course of this world. But he's telling them, he's encouraging the faithful to stay the course. It's important to remember that while Jesus is delivering this message in the hearing of those like the Pharisees and the scribes, he is delivering this to, I say in the hearing, potentially, he's delivering the message to his disciples. And so he's not delivering this from the standpoint of you're going down, but rather don't be taken down with what's about to come. He's encouraging faithfulness in the midst of what will be rampant unfaithfulness. In addition to all of that, one more thing that will happen in verse 14, the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. And so there's going to be this spread of the gospel that we see as we continue on into the book of Acts and into the epistles, as it points to that spreading of the gospel to the whole world, and maybe using that terminology to indicate the immediate known world there in that area of the globe. But that spread would come before these things take place. And I think that, again, speaks to that notion of this being the nail in the coffin, the final word. So the gospel is preached. In other words, everybody's got an opportunity to respond, and particularly Jews who are spread throughout those places have an opportunity to respond before that final axe is laid to the root, as John the Baptist would point out. That axe is brought down on the stump that is left, and it's just completely rooted out. And so before that foundation, Jerusalem being the foundation, the temple being a very foundational element of their faith, before that's taken away, he says they're going to have a chance. They're going to hear the gospel. They're going to be able to respond and make that transition before all of this happens. Well, then he brings in some Old Testament imagery and says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. And when we go back to the book of Daniel, there are several mentions, two mentions of that exact phrasing, abomination of desolation. But one of the first places that we see those words, abomination and desolation, being brought into those prophecies in the latter portion of Daniel is in Daniel chapter 9. And as we read through Daniel chapter 9, and particularly the immediate context of verse 27, where those words are used, what do we see there in Daniel 9 that connects to what Jesus is talking about here over in Matthew chapter 24? What do you think, Jeff?
Okay, so the timeline of Daniel's in chapter 9, verse 2 indicates that he is reading Jeremiah's prophecy about his condition. He is nearing the end of the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. This is after the destruction of Jerusalem the first time, after the temple was destroyed, the city was destroyed, and the people were taken into captivity. It's nearing the end of the 70 years that was prophesied by Jeremiah. And Daniel offers a prayer for forgiveness and a prayer for God's compassion on the people, based on reading the prophecy and seeing that he's nearing the end of the prophesied time. And he has a vision, and Gabriel, God's agent, whom he had seen in a vision prior, comes to him to explain what he was seeing. And in the course of that, we come to verse 26 and 27, the context of our question, what is happening in this context? Verse 26, beginning there, says, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. Verse 26 there, speaking of, verse 27 has the phrasing of the abominations. But the context of verse 26 that Jesus is pointing to in Matthew says, this is speaking of two events. This Messiah will be cut off, which I think is prophecy from Daniel that says the Messiah will have to die. Jesus has already told his disciples repeatedly that he is coming to Jerusalem and he will die on a cross and he will be raised on the third day. And along with that, he says the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing or no one. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. I think referring to the destruction that Jesus is speaking of. So in Matthew 24, Jesus explains the prophecy of Daniel is about to be fulfilled.
Yeah, the idea of bringing that forward, and when you see that we talk about messianic language. This isn't just messianic language. It says the Messiah. What's going to happen? And so you just see that sort of melding those notions there in Daniel chapter 9 now with Matthew 24. And I think this is the ultimate culmination. God speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem on more than one occasion as we go throughout the Old Testament. And so it's not new language, but I think that this speaks to the ultimate destruction in that it would be that destruction that would be connected with the cutting off or the destruction of the Messiah. And so those two things culminating here now that Jesus is here. Well, he says, when you see that abomination of desolation, then what are you supposed to do? Or particularly, what are the faithful supposed to do? And so, Luke, what's his instruction there to the faithful when they see the abomination of desolation?
Well, especially in verses 17 through 18, well, in verse 16, that he's at the end of verse 16, he says that you must flee to the mountains. And then he goes into more description in 17, whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things out of that, get the things out that are in his house. In verse 18, whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. So I think mainly what he's saying is, as soon as you see these things, flee, get out of there. And not just flee, but especially in verses 17 and 18, leave everything and flee. Leave everything and run. And I kind of think about Lot's wife when you look at this, this sense of urgency in you need to get out of here and don't look back. Don't think about anything here. Don't just forget it all. And even your own possessions, but he says to leave it all so that way you may flee. But then in verses 19 through 20, in verse 19, you see a contrast of those who, Jesus says, woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And then in verse 20, he says, but pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. And I think ultimately what we see in those verses are basically, again, leave everything and flee, and pray that it won't be, that when you see these things, it won't be a time where it's too late for you to flee. And pray that it's not a time where you will be greatly hindered in getting out of there and dropping everything and getting out of there. And so, again, ultimately, I think it's as soon as you see these things, leave everything and flee.
I think one thing that's interesting about that is that when you, well, first of all, if he's telling the faithful to run away, to go somewhere more safe, then that certainly does not point to the notions of a rapture, does it? Because the faithful would be spirited away. They would be pulled out of this earth. And so what's this instruction about? I mean, why are you telling these people to run when they'll be the ones who are safe? But rather, he gives instructions that are rooted in the continuation of the temporal world and the continuation of the faithful on that temporal plane. In addition to that, he does not give the faithful the comfort in this instance that they will be safe from the fallout of this destruction, but rather it's going to be very difficult for them. So as you mentioned, the idea of hoping it's not during the winter and hoping it's not during a time when you're in labor, hoping it's not a time where it makes that more difficult. In other words, it's going to be difficult. There are natural occurrences that could make it more difficult. And so for the faithful, the prayer is, the desire is that it would be as manageable as possible, but certainly not that this isn't going to affect you that much. No, it's going to affect you a great deal. And the Jews throughout the known world would be affected by this, not just those in Jerusalem, but really the fallout because of the sort of negative light that this put on the Jews really throughout. They became a hated class of people. And so in so many ways, they would have to flee, not just from Jerusalem itself, but from the persecution of society. But particularly in Jerusalem, there would be faithful. Remember, the church that was started in Jerusalem, we don't know what the size of that church would have been by the time of AD 70, but we know just one generation earlier, that church had grown to over 5,000 members right here in this city that's about to be destroyed. And so just imagine, if you will, a location where the faithful in that community number to that level, and that community is about to be utterly destroyed. And so it would be very impactful to God's people for Jerusalem to be destroyed. It's not just unfaithful people who will live in Jerusalem, but certainly there's a great many who are faithful. So they see the signs, they need to run. They need to go find a place of safety. Well, he also gives, I think, what is some comforting words that this period will not just go on and on. Caleb, how long does he say this period is going to last? And maybe also, why does he say it's going to be shortened?
He doesn't give a specific date or a length of time, but he does say that for the sake of the elect, the days would be cut short. So he warns that if anyone is saying, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, trying to give them hope that it was over, not to believe them, because when it was over, there was no way to tell when it would be over, but he did tell them that for the elect's sake, it would be.
Yeah, and so I think that's an important thing to note for a couple of reasons. First of all, the idea that this is a temporary judgment that is coming. It is not ultimate judgment that is coming, and so it speaks to a time period after which the elect will go on. And so they will suffer along with the fallout. There will be consequences of that. But those faithful Jews, the idea of pursuing Judaism and all those who are, ethnic Jews, we might say, will get swept up, even if they become Christians. That doesn't matter to the Roman government. They might be swept up with that. And he says there's going to be a limit. And so just as you said, there's not a firm, here's where the limit will be, here's the day that it'll end. He's just saying, trust me, it will end. And that would be important. As they would be in the midst of that, these words would certainly be words of comfort to them to know, hey, we know this isn't going to last forever. We know there's going to be a moment when this ends. We've just got to hold on, go find our place of safety. God has promised that this reign of terror will come to an end. And he says it's for the elect. That's who I'll cut it short for. I think that's important as a message to Israel. It's not because God will look at Israel as the nation and go, okay, we don't want to go too far. No, as far as they're concerned, destruction. There is no resuscitating. There's no bringing back the nation of Israel, no bringing back Jerusalem. The only concern in this going too far is that it would consume his people. And so that is the merciful aspect of this, is the mercy towards those who actually care what God thinks, those who are the elect. For their sakes, he will put a stopping point on the other end of this. Well, he uses some language then here. He says that the sun and the moon, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Just before that, he says, for as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. There's a lot of sort of symbolic language here. I think that we can see that lightning language being the swiftness of it. We can see the coming of the Son of Man. We can see the coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord, being language throughout the Old Testament that indicates that God is coming. And a lot of times we think of that only in terms of God coming to greet those who have a reward. But really in the Old Testament, far more frequently, that language of God coming is a reckoning. It's a judgment that is coming. And so I think that as we look at the language that's being used here, and it's the similar language that we find in the Old Testament, we see that is judgment language. As we look at the idea of the sun losing its light, the moon losing its light, the stars falling, and so forth, Jeff, are there any places in the Old Testament where we see that kind of language being used?
Yes, Stephen, just as you stated, this type of language about the sun and the moon being darkened and the stars falling from the sky are mentioned multiple times by the prophets associated with judgments. Isaiah 13, verse 10, uses this language in regards to the fall of Babylon. Isaiah 24, verse 23, the sun and moon will be ashamed and abashed, is a judgment on the earth. Ezekiel 32, verses 7 and 8, it is a judgment. It uses that same language in conjunction with the Pharaoh of Egypt will be extinguished, and there will be the sun and moon will not give their light, I believe is the phrasing there. Joel chapter 2, verses 10 and verse 31, and again, that those two talk about a day of the Lord and these same attributes of the sun and the moon being darkened. Joel chapter 3, there's a judgment of Tyre and Sidon and of Philistia, with the same reckoning signs being the sun and the moon being darkened. And then Amos chapter 5, a day of the Lord will be accompanied by darkness. And again in Amos chapter 8, again stating that the day of the Lord will also be in darkness. And then Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 15, it speaks there of a day of the Lord, a judgment on Judah. And Judah will be subjected to a day of wrath and a day of darkness. So the sun and the moon being darkened and even the stars falling from the sky are often used, imagery used in the Old Testament judgments provided by the prophets, judgments of God.
Yeah, and you didn't hit every passage, but you hit enough of them to make the point, which is this is very common language. I think one of the things that gets a lot of people in trouble when they're studying through particularly prophetic language, and particularly prophetic language in the New Testament, is that they do so without the background of Old Testament prophecy. New Testament prophecy is built on the foundation of Old Testament prophecy. And so when we see phrases, when we see imagery being used in the New Testament, it is drawing on commonly understood inferences, commonly understood imagery, phrases, and so forth from the Old Testament. And what happens is the same thing that happens when a person goes from one country to another country. And there are turns of phrases that either are completely foreign, we don't know what they mean at all, or maybe even worse, in one country they mean one thing, and in another country they mean something else, and maybe that something else is entirely offensive. I know people who speak maybe Spanish, and of course there's many, many countries in the world that are Spanish speaking, and to go from one Spanish speaking country to another, you can find some very drastic difference in phraseology. Same thing is true as you go from English speaking countries from one to another. There can be drastically different meanings associated with certain phrases. There's even words that we use utterly different. I won't bring up any of the offensive versions of that, but just to give a mild example, we would talk about a boot, and the only thing we would associate a boot and a car as being is maybe something to do with a boot that slides over a gasket or something like that. But they mean the trunk of the car. And so there could be some real confusion that could come up that way. Well, I think that people have not familiarized themselves with the vocabulary of the Old Testament. They're just lost when they hear Jesus talking here. And they'll say things, I think really silly things like, I just want to take Jesus at his word. Well, I do too. I want to take him at his word, but I want to take him at his word, realizing that Jesus speaks as the prophets of old have spoken. And I also want to just throw in there this, that if we're being reasonable and we're not being sort of blinded by fantastical or desire for a fantastical interpretation of this, we know that we use language that is very similar. So yesterday was September 11th, which is the anniversary of a terrorist attack here in the United States. How many people have referred to that day as a dark day? Now, I remember that day. It was sunny, at least where I live, on that day. And yet I remember it as a very dark day. And so we don't literally mean everything went dark. We just mean that emotionally, sort of politically, the outlook of the future, all those things are dark. They're negative is what we're saying. And so it's a really bad day. How bad? It's as if the sun itself went out. It's as if the moon itself no longer shines. And those in power, you see stars often in the Old Testament refer to those who are in political power, and they fall from the sky. Can you imagine stars just start plummeting out of the sky? That is the level of shock that these people would feel when they see Jerusalem and its leaders come crumbling down. They thought that this was unassailable, just like they did really in the Old Testament. So it's a repetition of the history, but only more intense, I believe. And so we do very well to steep ourselves in the vocabulary of the Old Testament as we come into the New Testament and try to interpret particularly that sort of apocalyptic language that you see in Matthew 24, even more so over in the book of Revelation. And it's a dangerous thing to start at the end of the story and think that you can interpret if you've not read anything that leads up to that. Well, we're going to wrap up there on that question, and we'll pick up as we continue through the remainder of those indicators and what he says about those indicators, and then maybe see that transition into another focus as we go towards the end of the chapter. Appreciate these guys being with us, Luke and Jeff and Caleb. Appreciate your input to these questions today. And we appreciate the input that the viewers send in from time to time. You can comment on the video here. If you have further questions, you can contact us through our website, and we certainly encourage and invite you to do that. We'd love to study this or any portion of the Bible with you further, and to help all of us come to know God more, to draw closer to him. We hope that this study's been beneficial to you. We hope that you'll join us again this Wednesday night. Again, we're live streaming our Wednesday night Bible study at 7 p.m. or thereabouts, and we encourage you to join us for that. If you don't make the live stream, you can see it as it is recorded and posted on YouTube just a little bit later, either that evening or sometime the next day. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that God will bless you as you draw near to Him.